Hey guys, what's going on? Playing back for another Netflix review, and today I'm going to be talking about Worth. Worth is an American drama that tells the true story of a lawyer named Kenneth Feinberg, who served as special master of the compensation fund that was set up for victims and their families who suffered from the September 11, 2001 terrorist attacks. Feinberg accepts the case pro bono, simply wanting to be of service to his country in its time of need, and thinking he can handle the case the same as any other he's had in the past, except he finds out that this is not the case, as he is greeted with extreme hostility from the victims and their families, who are demanding a lot more financial compensation than what they're getting. This forces Feinberg to re-examine not just his paperwork, but also his moral conscience in trying to determine what measures the financial worth of a person, all while trying to deal with varying degrees of pushback from both the government and the wealthy elite as he tries to come up with a resolution for the victims. So because this movie is based on real events and real people, both of which are still fresh in a lot of people's minds today, it is extremely important to get the details in a story like this right from the outset. Fortunately, I think the filmmakers did a fantastic job with telling this movie's story, as well as all the individual stories of the characters within. Michal Keaton plays the lead role of Kenneth Feinberg in this movie, and he does a phenomenal job in his performance. I don't want to slight any of the other characters in this movie because their stories are important to what's being told, but as far as the general narrative is concerned, Keaton is definitely the captain keeping the ship afloat. He starts off being crass and arrogant, thinking that money can solve everything, and generally not understanding the gravity of the situation he's immersed himself in. And it's not until he's immersed himself in it for a while that he finally starts to develop empathy for all the victims he interacts with and realizes that he needs to take a different approach in order to make things right. His character has to change in order to fit the situation, and the change occurs in a believable and organic manner, which I do appreciate. You really get a sense that his character realizes the error of his ways, and he's slowly but surely transforming over the course of the story, and I really enjoyed how Michal Keaton brought his character to life in this regard. Stanley Tucci does a great job too, playing the role of Charles Wolfe, one of Feinberg's harshest critics when it comes to the initial draft of the compensation fund. He's the source of a lot of the change that I mentioned earlier with regards to Feinberg's character, and I like how the movie displayed the relationship between the two as not necessarily being antagonistic, although they definitely weren't friends by any means. It's hard to ignore the strong central theme behind this movie's story and all the questions that it raises. What exactly determines the financial worth of a person, and what makes one person's worth higher or lower than another's? These are questions that I've asked myself on occasion, but I never truly considered them on a meaningful level until I watched this movie. In the story, Feinberg develops a financial formula that he develops with the help of his fellow lawyers that he feels will provide the best financial outcome for all the victims. The problem with the formula, however, is that it grants significantly more money to the wealthy elite as opposed to those who are in lower or middle class working positions. Because of this, many of the victims feel like their individual stories aren't being heard and tend to dismiss Feinberg as being little more than a government lackey. This results in a ton of uncomfortable scenarios between all the characters involved, and I mean that in a good way, of course. At times, the movie feels like a legal thriller just in terms of how tense all the meetings are that are featured in it. And speaking of the individual stories that I mentioned earlier, I think that's the best thing that this movie has going for it. There are a variety of victims featured in the story that all have a chance to have their voices be heard, and each one is completely different and unique from the other. Some stories are more humorous than others, but all of them are equally heartbreaking, and they all serve a purpose in helping Feinberg realize that the victims aren't statistics to be calculated on a formula. All of them have to be evaluated on a case-by-case basis so that everyone involved can determine what exactly the financial worth of that person truly is. In the same token, I don't think that the victims' stories would have been quite as effective if it weren't for Keaton's central performance bolstering them. He was really the glue that held this movie together, along with a few other details that are spread throughout that help to make the movie more authentic in its presentation. One example of this is how the movie uses actual stock footage of the aftermath of the terrorist attacks which took place in New York City. I think the filmmakers did a great job of using that footage in a tasteful manner, and it added a dose of gritty realism to the story, which I appreciated. There are some problems that reduce the effectiveness of its message, and thankfully most of them get overshadowed by Keaton's performance, but nonetheless there were still quirks that came up that left me scratching my head. There are a lot, and I mean a lot, of meetings that are featured in this movie. Lawyers meeting victims, meeting other lawyers, meeting coworkers, meeting random Joes off the street. There are meetings everywhere in this movie, and they're all interesting to a certain extent, but they tend to interrupt the flow and pace of the story. It kind of depends on how much legal jargon you're willing to process at any given moment. It's not necessarily a complicated movie, it's fairly straightforward in its narrative, but because there's so much stuff that's covered in any given meeting, it can be easy to miss out on important plot details if you're not paying attention. One thing about the movie that still confuses me revolves around the character Lee Quinn. I get that he's supposed to be an antagonist of sorts and he's allied with the wealthy elite and all that, but he just doesn't appear enough in the movie to stand out to me, especially considering that anytime he does appear, he refers to himself as a friend of Feinberg's, so I didn't really understand what the filmmakers were getting at with his character. Overall, Worth is a poignant drama that highlights an important question one must consider when evaluating the circumstances of horrifying events, especially one as notable in human history as this one. If you enjoy legal dramas and you can tolerate the slow pacing that's often featured in them, I guarantee that you would enjoy watching this movie. There are some details that are still lost on me, but its main message couldn't have been more clear. I can't say for certain how much a life would exactly be worth, if any amount, but I'm glad there are people out there like Kenneth Feinberg to help point out that life is definitely worth something. Anyways guys, that's going to wrap up my review of Worth. Thanks for watching this video, I hope you enjoyed it, and as always stay tuned for the next part, where next time I review the Swedish romance, JJ&E. Bye bye!